First, thank you very much for the introduction. And indeed, my kids, every now and then, they'll see on television some show that has a U.S. senator, and it always be like they live in this house that occupies an entire city block, and they're going, "Dad, what happened?" And I'm very proud that my kids are growing up in a working-class neighborhood and understand the fundamentals of what makes this nation strong. That it's not a few at the very top having everything. It's American families having the foundation for a high quality of life. We shouldn't measure the success of our nation by how high our GDP is or what the top 1% has, but how many families have a strong financial foundation for success. And so that's the perspective that I bring to every fight. And I must say, as you were talking about speaking of the fight, a fight that we had in Oregon, and do we have some Oregon firefighters here? All right, great. Well, some of them may have been there to witness this, but essentially we had the bill for safety and staffing to be mandatory part of negotiations. We had 300 firefighters come to the Capitol. They filled every seat plus overflow rooms. And this is when I was a Speaker of the House in 2007. And the minority leader would not let the bill actually be brought up for debate. Now, normally the way it would work is you had a group present that you would say, okay, let's move that bill to the front of the list of the bills to be debated and voted on as a courtesy. And that courtesy was deliberately denied. So for something like 4 hours, 300 firefighters were sitting waiting for that. And I thought, if I've ever seen a case of bad policy and bad politics combined, that was the moment. And the good news is at the end of the battle, not that day, but it took another month or so, we ended up succeeding in passing that bill. And it was of great value to firefighters throughout our state. So I was going to give you a little broad overview of what's going on. And the first is that we are investing too much as a nation in foreign bases and foreign wars, and we're not investing not nearly enough in infrastructure and education back home. The result is we're doing way too much nation building abroad and not nearly enough nation building right here at home. To get a sense of how seriously we're neglecting our infrastructure, China is spending 10% of its gross domestic product on infrastructure. You go there a couple years apart, you see all kinds of changes. Europe, a key competitor, is investing 5%. We're investing 2%. We are barely repairing the roads and bridges, the water systems that we created after World War II, let alone expanding them as a foundation for a better economy. And this really matters in terms of employment of our construction industry and the creation of living wage jobs now and in the future. And on education, we're becoming the first set of adults in the history of this country whose children are getting less education than we got because of the soaring costs. And that is absolutely the wrong way to go. We're in a knowledge economy world. We're in competition with the world. Education has to be invested in. So these are not good pieces, and they combine to see the American dream start to be slipping away. Those American families in my community who grew up thinking, my family has a 3-bedroom ranch house, and you know what, maybe my family will have a little better house or a little better foundation, a little better retirement, are finding that they're very lucky if they can buy their house from their parents, because they are being stretched by the loss of living wage jobs and the replacement with service jobs at near minimum wage. And I don't think any one of us in this room would want to have to support our kids and provide a bright future for them at $8+ an hour without benefits. That would be extraordinarily difficult. And this is why the organization of working people is so important. It's why your union is so important. A union that I think is the only one in the country to have expanded its membership every year over 95 years. Extraordinary accomplishment, and so much has been done in the last decade to continue this fight for a strong, fair wages for working people. So the American dream is slipping away, and we have to reverse that. And to give you a sense of what's happened between 1990 and today, so roughly over 20 years, the share of wealth held by the bottom 50% has gone from 3+% to 1%. 1/3, and from an already low level of 3% to a minuscule 1%. Half the population holds only 1% of the wealth in this country, while the top 10% has increased their share of the wealth to 3/4. So 1 out of 100 folks, they own 3/4 of the wealth. This wealth disparity is not an America with a strong middle class. And that is why we have to do a lot of job creation, a lot of problem solving here in Washington, D.C. But instead of problem solving, you're seeing partisan positioning. And it's enormously frustrating. And one of the things that has resulted in that frustration are polls that say kind of how do people judge Congress? And I think it's down to about 93% have an unfavorable view and 7% have a favorable view, historically low ratings. But even then, I have to ask the question, are those 7% not paying attention? Because I think if they were, it'd be 0% having a favorable sense. Because we are simply not getting the job done. And if you look at the paralysis that has gripped this city, you will start to understand why it is such a mess. Let me give you an example. During the 6 years that Lyndon B. Johnson was Majority Leader of the Senate, only one time did he have to file a petition to try to end debate so he could get to a final majority vote. One time in 6 years. In the last 6 years, Harry Reid, our Majority Leader, had to file 391 petitions to try to close debate and get to a final vote. And here's the way it would work. You've been debating a bill Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You go into Monday and you say, look, everybody's had their say. Let's get to a final vote. And in the U.S. Senate, that has to be done by unanimous consent. So you ask for unanimous consent. In the past, it would be granted because only on a rare once in a career would you say, no, all 100 senators stand aside for my particular special interest. It has to be something very special and very deep. But now it's become routine. So when you ask for unanimous consent on a Monday to hold a vote, someone objects, even though nobody has anything to say. Someone objects. It takes them 1 second. I object. That's it. So on Tuesday, you have to file a petition. You can't vote on the petition until Thursday to close debate. And let's say you have 60 votes to close debate. Then you have to have an additional 30 hours of debate before you can vote. So now you're into Sunday, assuming you actually went straight through the weekend every week. So that 1 second objection on a Monday has wasted at least a full week of the Senate's time. So if there were 391 petitions, that's 391 wasted weeks. Now, in 6 years, there are not 391 weeks. So you start to see why it is the Senate has been completely paralyzed by the breakdown in the social contract where people would let the Senate function. And that's why we have to change the rules. We have a responsibility to fix the broken Senate so we can address the big issues facing America. This paralysis is working systematically for the very special interests that have leagues of lobbyists and systematically against the interests of working Americans. And so we have to change it. We have to condense that week, even when you get a successful vote, to a much shorter period of time. We need to change the vote counting. So instead of 60 required to close debate, you take 41 to extend debate. And it may just sound like flipping the math, but it means the absent folks don't count automatically for extending debate. And often you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 folks who are absent. And then if folks vote for more debate, if 41 say more debate's needed, they should actually have to stand up and make their case before their colleagues, make their case before the American people. And the American people can weigh in on whether they are a hero or whether they're a bum. And I'll tell you that accountability and transparency will help the American public see the paralysis, respond to it, and tell their senators, get your act together and address these big issues facing our country. Well, as a result of this dysfunction, we have the sequester. Sequester came out of the Budget Control Act 2 years ago. It contained a clause that created a super committee to try to produce a budget deal. And if that failed, it had a series of cuts that would occur, and these cuts were called the hammer. And they are comprised essentially of Dumb and Dumber. You've heard of the movie Dumb and Dumber? Well, now you're seeing the sequel here in Washington, D.C. And that includes the cutting the key cuts to things like the SAFER grants and the FIRE grants for equipment and training that many of your departments have utilized so effectively. I tried to get the numbers for Oregon. Oregon looks like in 2013 fiscal year, so from last October 1st through this September 30th, we are losing about $450,000 in SAFER grants and about $290,000 in FIRE grants, and that's going to be felt by fire districts across our state and in fire districts across the nation. And in addition, the communities are being impacted by all kinds of other cuts that are causing them to wrestle with their budgets. And it's just basically everything that you could possibly value. If it's funds for inoculations for children, it's cut. If it's Head Start, it's cut. If it's funds for Title I for low-income schools, K-12, it's cut, and on and so forth. So what we're not cutting are the tax giveaways to the most powerful special interests in America. We give away billions of dollars to the richest oil companies because many decades ago, when oil was very low in price, we said, okay, you need some extra funds for exploration. Well, has anybody noticed that oil is no longer low in price and that the private market does a huge job of incentivizing and funding exploration? Well, apparently not enough people have noticed because we've left those brakes in place, spending billions of dollars, giving it away to oil companies that are just stashing it in the bank, and while we're cutting fire grants and SAFER grants for our fire departments across America. This makes no sense. So we had a bill to replace the sequester. And what happened to that bill? It was filibustered. So you start to see the pattern that occurs. Now we had, just last night, we had a continuing resolution that was filibustered, but we were able to overcome it last night and get the 60-plus votes to end debate. But is that going to help us? Well, it's not going to help us with the grants that you all depend on. Essentially, they're going to be funded at the same level. It's going to give more flexibility to the Defense Department, but it's not going to give much more flexibility to many other areas. And then we have a Senate budget that's been proposed. So this is different than the continuing resolution, but this would lay out the vision for the next 10 years. This is the sequel to the Budget Control Act that produced the mess we have right now. And this budget, it would replace the sequester. So we're going to be having that fight over the next few days, trying to adopt this on the floor of the Senate. But it only lays out the vision. Then you have to have appropriation bills to back it up. And to have the budget set the framework for that, it has to be adopted by the House as well. So we're at the beginning of trying to replace this lurching, this careening from crisis to crisis with a rational budget and appropriation process. You know, there was a time where the Senate was referred to as the world's greatest deliberative body. But I don't think any American watching what's going on here in the Capitol would say that today. In fact, people around the world are looking at Americans saying, what happened? What happened to their legislative process? Really one of the best crafted, wonderful, terrific advocacies of the people, by the people, for the people. What happened? Well, we have to end the partisan divisions and the abuse of the rules that has degraded the ability to take on the issues that will build and support, strengthen the middle class. And we can do it. And it's why I've called for a series of bold reforms. And as you mentioned, we got little modest reforms with the promise of comity. Comity is not a word used very much, but it was used a lot when those modest reforms were passed, that we'd have a social contract to go with it, that the process wouldn't be abused in the way I've been describing. But in the last 2 months have shown anything, they've shown abuse more than ever before. The first ever filibuster of a defense secretary. A commitment in writing to absolutely filibuster anyone proposed for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, as if consumer protection is not good. Where I come from, fighting predatory schemes that destroy families is not okay. And that's why we need the CFPB. And we should certainly not have a situation where anyone nominated to head is going to be filibustered even before we know their qualifications. And the list goes on and on. So that is the basic overview. And I'm delighted to have the invitation to come and talk to you all. But I'm particularly pleased to be a partner for hardworking men and women across this nation. Thank you for being part of a union, for being part of an effort to secure fair wages and fair working conditions. We need that for every single American family. Thank you very much.